This is Theology Bits, a ministry of Central Lutheran Church, Eugene, Oregon. I'm Pastor Ben. We continue with our series, The World of the New Testament, here focusing on books and readers. This is, in this larger context of the New Testament, what we're really talking about would be the New Testament itself. What is it that people would pick up if they wanted to read the New Testament? Well, the first thing to understand about writing and reading in the ancient world is the various forms of writing and reading. Of course, the most common form in the first century was the scroll. This is how most writing was presented on paper. There were also other materials one would see commonly, things carved into stone, into wood, on wax, different things like that. But if it was on paper of various sorts, mostly papyrus or parchment, papyrus being a plant, papyrus plant, in fact, that was fibers that were mashed together and created kind of a paper. That's where we get our word paper. Or parchment, meaning early animal skins that were used. Parchment, of course, lasted much longer. It was far sturdier, far thicker, but, of course, was far more expensive. But on the scroll, this was where most writing was presented at this time period. However, there has been a new, I don't want to call it new invention because that's not quite right, but a new tendency to use a different kind of media with paper, which was the codex, or what we would call a book, meaning rather than a roll, which was one long piece that was continuous, you had pages that you turned that were sewn in the center. And the different formats kind of emphasize different aspects of reading, if you think about it. Because after all, the scroll encourages you to read end to end. That is, if you want to find one passage in the middle of a scroll, it's difficult to do. You'd have to turn and turn and turn to find that one little passage. And it really encourages you to start reading at the beginning and keep going until you get to the end. The codex, by contrast, kind of encourages you to flip around, to find select passages. You can open the book at any place at the first start and start there. Further, the codex is a little more mobile. Now, not necessarily, these weren't exactly small things. It's not like you could throw these in your backpack the way a modern book is, but it was more mobile. It was more easily transported, especially because you could stack them more easily. And the scroll is, of course, also you had to use more of it because in theory you could write on both sides of a scroll, but it was difficult. When you're rolling a scroll in one way, just as any of you have rolled paper together, if you try to roll it the other way so you can write the back, it doesn't like it. It kind of, the natural curve that you've created wants to stay there, whereas the codex is made to use both sides. So it was in some ways a little bit cheaper. And so you have different forms. What you might be surprised by is that some people credit Christianity with the rise of the codex. It's not really true that Christianity invented the codex, that's not true, but it certainly popularized it. It was, in fact, the Bible, and specifically the New Testament Bible, that popularizes this form of writing, this form of reading. And to recognize that, by the way, when we talk about the books of the Bible, that the reason we don't call them chapters in an edited volume, but instead books of the Bible, is that there was a real limit to how big these things could be, just with the physical limitations. Often about 50 pages is all you could get, which is why they were separate books. And so we're seeing differences on these different things. Scrolls, by the way, could be much longer and were far less mobile. Christianity, of course, wants it to be really mobile, and you want to be able to go read select passages, to have a pericope and then have a sermon about it or a homily. Whereas not as easy to do that with a scroll. Well, the thing about the other component is we start seeing relationship between books and communities. Meaning, when it came to the New Testament itself, most communities didn't have all the books in plural. Instead, it was which books did they have? And it wasn't necessarily because they didn't want these as if it was some kind of ideological thing, but it was simply what did they have? What was present before them? For example, in the early Pauline communities, they had Paul's letters, but they didn't have any Gospels because, of course, there were no Gospels. And then once there were Gospels, they start getting circulated, but many communities might just have one because that's all they had. The other thing they might have had is the famous Septuagint, which, of course, many people, when they see a scroll, automatically think about Torah scrolls. Well, the Septuagint was the Greek translation, sometimes abbreviated just to LXX for 70, you see 70 in there, was the Greek translation of the Old Testament. Our copies of this, I have to tell you, are far less like this, where there were just independent ones. Instead, we have more complete Septuagints. And I say that with the understanding that sometimes all we have are particular pages, but that's because it's been broken down. And it's almost always in scrolls rather than codices. And so we have some different aspects here that really lead to different ways of distributing this information. Also, to be understood, which is probably sort of natural for most of you as you're seeing this and thinking about it, is that these are manuscripts. Manuscripts means hand written. And as a result, book production is a very piecemeal and different thing, because the cost of a book had two components. One was the materials upon which it was written. The other was the cost of someone transcribing it. There was very frequently the amanuensis of an author, meaning an amanuensis is the hand writer. In Romans 16 it says, I, Tertius, the writer of this letter, greet you. And what he means is he's the actual writer of the letter. The amanuensis, the one who is hired to be the scribe who writes this out. And the way in which books were circulated were through sharing and then copying. And sometimes people would share a particular manuscript and not really intend for it to be copied, but it would anyway. On the other end, it would go ahead and be copied, and then it would get distributed and distributed and distributed. We have some evidence of some people in the classical world saying, don't distribute this yet. And then, of course, it happens anyway. And so we see a totally different book culture and book production, and it was all about networks. Who did you know? And if you wanted to find out a new piece of information, you had to know the right person. Christianity tries to spread these things widely, but you did need a community who wanted to read it. And reading, by the way, was public recitation was the norm. Sometimes it's said that people didn't know how to read silently in the ancient world. That's not true. They absolutely did know how to read silently. But it would have been seen as incredibly rude to read silently. Reading was for community. And so public reading was an action. And this is where we can get to literacy conversations, because many people didn't know the skill of reading, but they would regularly attend public recitation of written text, and you could see it was a written text, to the point that you eventually end up with recitation of written text, which of course, if you're reciting it, you don't actually need the book there to do it. You just have to know it. And so the relationship between the book and the reader become quite united. The reader is a key component here, the human who's able to do it. In fact, there was this challenge of, we often call it the oral versus the textual traditions. In the ancient world, they were seen as the same. That is, if you had a text, the text itself did nothing. It was the reader who did something. The living person. Because why would you trust a text that's just sitting there? How could you ask it a question? How do you know that it's trustworthy? Well, it was the reader who was trustworthy. The reader was the person you could ask the question to. And so it's a totally different world. And so when Paul sends his letters out into the world, or the Gospels are written and to be distributed widely, it was depending on there would be communities with readers, who they're the ones who can proclaim these Gospels. The Gospel in and of itself doesn't proclaim anything. A reader can proclaim the message, because the reader is the one who can have a relationship, because texts are relationship documents. And so this is a totally different way of thinking about texts and books than we have in our modern world. This has been an overview of books and readers in the ancient world, thinking about the world of the New Testament. I'm Pastor Ben.